work I've been doing with Steve Dakin, my supervisor, Maria Kelly, who I've never actually met. Who's also she's really good. So I'm going to be talking about migraine, which, to give you a brief introduction, is an episodic disorder characterised by throbbing, normally unilateral head pain. And it can be accompanied by nausea, vomiting, and photophobia or phonophobia, which is an aversion to sound or light. And there's a number of reasons that there's been a long-standing interest in vision in migraine. Firstly, about 30% of people with migraine experience a sensory disturbance, or what's called an aura. This is predominantly visual in nature. It can come before a migraine attack or during a migraine attack. There's also a subset of people with migraine who experience visually triggered migraines. So when you have a highly salient image or a very high contrast grating, for instance, not only will they experience discomfort, but they actually might get a migraine triggered. But also relevant to what we're talking about is there's also a whole range of documented visual psychophysical abnormalities that have been documented in migraine. And there's a whole range of these that have been described, but one of the most predominant ones, or one of the most robust ones that keep coming up in literature, is in relation to motion processing. Now, typically, people with migraine perform normal classifying or discrimination motions of direction when it comes to a single motion of direction. So when they have to classify the direction of a drifting ball or a bunch of dots that are drifting, when all the dots are drifting in exactly the same direction, but they typically show elevated motion coherence thresholds. And hopefully you know what motion coherence threshold is from the talks today, but just briefly, so you have a bunch of dots. Again, apologies, it's a bit small, as Steve immediately pointed out as I put it up on the screen. But in this case, you have to discriminate whether the dots are drifting to the right or to the left. In this case, they're drifting to the right, as denoted by the small arrows. These are the signal dots. And then this is the distribution of directions present in the motion signal. So the vertical is denoted by the dotted line, and the signal direction is denoted by the line. It's just a line because they're all moving in exactly the same direction. Now the task is made harder in the motion coherence task by then dropping dots in the stimulus that move in random directions, totally random directions. So in this case they're depicted by black dots with arrows that are pointing in random directions, and here you see the noise represents, the noise is, it's a flat function, it's sampled from a random distribution moving completely random directions of motion. And obviously this task is harder to form, and then you can manipulate again this signal to noise ratio. It's the proportion of signal to noise dots in the stimulus, and adapt it on trial-by-trial version so you can find the coherence threshold. So the amount of signal is needed to correctly identify the direction of motion as left or right, and say, let's say 82% of trials, which is what we've used. Now typically, a whole series of studies have shown that in migraine, coherence thresholds are elevated.
So Mark, this is while they're having a migraine?
No, this is interactive. This is between sort of migraine attacks. Not many migraineurs would actually want to sit and look at moving stimuli when it's going on. So anyway, so the migraines typically have elevated coherence thresholds, meaning that they need a higher proportion of signal dots to discriminate the direction of motion at a similar level. Okay, so this has typically been interpreted in terms of a global pooling deficit. The idea being maybe the migraineurs are undersampling the visual field, they're gathering information from a subset of the dots, so they're not getting a good estimate of the average signal direction. However, it's been suggested you could also get elevated coherence thresholds if you had a local processing deficit, if you had elevated internal noise like we'll be discussing today. So in other words, if you had a poor estimate of individual directions of motion. But also, what has recently been suggested is that you might also get elevated coherence thresholds if you were poor at segregating the signal from the noise. So it's been shown from computational modelling of psychophysical data that observers just don't sort of naively integrate all the information across the signal and noise dot directions. Actually, what they're probably doing is monitoring relevant directions of motion. So in a coherence task, they're monitoring left and right directions of motion. So the idea would be, just to summarise that part, is that although it's pretty consistently found that there's elevated coherence thresholds in migraine, the problem is that this coherence task confounds local processing, global processing, and noise exclusion processes. Now luckily, as we've been talking about a lot today, we've got this motion equivalent noise task, which I'm not going to go into too much, because hopefully after having gone over it so many times, it's beginning to sink in a bit. But the basic idea is the motion equivalent noise task allows us to get independent estimates of of local and global processing. And further, independent estimates, they're independent of the ability to exclude noise. So, like I said, motion equivalent noise task allows us to get independent estimates of local and global processing. So using these two tasks, the point of the work I've been doing recently is to determine whether motion processing deficits in migraine, or more specifically elevated coherence thresholds in migraine, are due to global pooling, or a deficit in global pooling, i.e. sampling, problems in local processing, i.e. elevated internal noise, or problems with segregating the signal from the noise. Okay, so the first thing we did was we wanted to replicate the finding of elevated motion coherence thresholds in migraine, and I'm just going to whip through this. But basically we had 22 migrainers, 22 controls that age and sex matched, and they had to do the standard motion coherence task where they had to judge whether the signal motion was left or right, and 100 white dots, 50% contrast, and the motion was at 3 degrees per second. And the stimulus presentation time was 400 milliseconds. And Quest tracked the 82% coherence threshold. In other words, the proportion, what proportion of signal to noise dots would support 82% correct performance. And we had 75 trials per stellar case, 15 practice trials. Okay, so these are the results we found, and basically we replicated previous results and showed that coherence thresholds are elevated in migraine relative to controls. In other words, they need a higher proportion of signal to noise dots to achieve the same level of performance, discriminating the direction of motion. However, as I'm trying to pound into everyone's head, this measure confounds local processing, global processing, and noise exclusion processes. So then what we did is we took the same participants and we randomized the order in which we presented the task, the equivalent noise, and the coherence task. And we got them to do this rapid equivalent noise task that Stephen was talking about. So they had to judge whether the signal motion was clockwise or anti-clockwise or vertical. The stimulus had the same stimulus structure with respect to things like contrast of the elements, the speed of the elements, but instead of using equivalent motion coherence, we used this rapid equivalent noise analysis method that Stephen was talking about, whereby you inserted 2 staircases, one which tracked the minimal directional offset threshold, and one that tracked the maximum level of noise that can be tolerated for a large signal. And this we used to efficiently constrain equivalent noise function to the data, giving us estimates of local noise and sampling. So just to recap, to remind you, this is a standard equivalent noise method where you estimate offset thresholds for a bunch of external noise levels to constrain the fit, whereas we constrain the fit and just use 2 separate data points, the offset threshold and the maximum level of tolerable noise. Okay, so the motion equivalent noise data. So first of all, this is the estimates of sampling, so how well the migrainers are being able to pull the information. And what we find is there's absolutely no difference at all between the migrainers and the controls. So this is interesting because traditionally elevated coherence thresholds have been thought to be driven by this parameter, by the ability to pull information, by the ability to average the information available in the stimulus. And this is the results we found with respect to internal noise. Now there's a small elevation in internal noise, and it's just under significance. If you correct for multiple comparisons, it disappears, but basically there's a small elevation in internal noise. But critically, what I'm hopefully going to show you now is that this difference in internal noise cannot be driving the difference in coherence thresholds that have been shown by others and by us in migraine. And this is why. So first of all, if you just look at a basic bivariate correlation between internal noise and coherence thresholds, you find that they're not correlated at all. That's a p-value of 0.18. So internal noise does not correlate with coherence, whereas in contrast, sampling, so global pooling, correlates highly significantly with coherence thresholds, negatively, the way you would expect. So that high coherence thresholds is associated with low pooling. So if you're pooling information from a small area of the visual field, then you're going to have elevated coherence thresholds.
Mark, what are the white and black dots?
These are the migrainers and the controls. The migrainers are the whites. So you're seeing the elevated motion coherence thresholds. And yeah, it's a good point. Next, what we wanted to look at was to put this information in a regression model to see whether, in internal noise, sampling, so global pooling, and group. So in other words, whether you are a migraine or a control is able to predict coherence thresholds. And what we find is that sort of reflecting the pattern in the correlations. Sorry, so start again. So what we did, there were three variables that we wanted to see, three predictive variables: internal noise, sampling group, and the extent to which they predicted differences in coherence thresholds. So it's a non-hierarchical regression model where we put all the parameters into the model at once. It's highly significant and predicted 52% of the variance in coherence thresholds. And what we find is, reflecting the correlational data, is that internal noise is not a predictor of coherence thresholds, whereas I'm just going ahead of myself. Whereas pooling is, the sampling is a highly significant predictor of coherence thresholds. Yeah, reflecting the correlational data. But significantly, group membership, still over and above what is explained by variance in sampling internal noise, is still predicting a significant proportion of variance in coherence thresholds. Does that kind of make sense? So what that's implying is the difference in the migraine and the control group cannot be captured by differences in internal noise and efficiency. There must be something else. It's not explaining it all. So conclusions that I come to, if we go back to the questions I originally posed, is what drives elevated coherence thresholds in migraine? And we originally suggested there were three possibilities. One is global integration, pooling of information. One is local processing, so potentially elevated internal noise, and one is noise segregation. And we're pretty sure it's not global integration, because from the equivalent noise studies we show that sampling rates are indistinguishable between the migraineurs and the controls. I think it's unlikely to be local processing, because although there was a small elevation in internal noise, that didn't correlate with coherence thresholds, it didn't predict coherence thresholds. So which basically leaves us with noise segregation. And so the prediction would be that people with migraine are going to be normal on any integration task, where all they have to do is integrate all the information and stimulus, whereas they're going to be impaired on global tasks that require segregation of the noise and the signal. And just quickly to finish, someone was talking about the importance of studying these things in different modalities of different dimensions and different conditions, and I agree completely. And I didn't talk about it just because I didn't think I had enough time, but I've also been running this task, equivalent noise task, in other visual dimensions. So it's very easy to create a comparable orientation equivalent noise task, because you can control the mean and standard deviation of a bunch of Gabors, and just basically run exactly the same procedure. And using the same participants, and again we randomise the order of the task, we find that internal noise is normal in the migraineurs relative to the controls, and so is orientation. And again, we can do a comparable task in the domain of size, equivalent noise task for size, and again we find that internal noise is normal in migraine, and size and in sampling is normal in migraine. It would be nice to have the coherence data for these tasks as well, which I don't, because when we originally started the experiments, my expectation was going to be, that basically it was going to be sampling that was driving the differences in between the migraineurs and the controls. But in the literature, there is evidence that migraineurs are impaired on coherence thresholds with respect to tasks that don't just relate to motion. So it looks as if, at least in these visual domains, the elevated coherence thresholds in migraines probably are not driven by increases in internal noise or sort of the sampling of the stimulus. And that's it. Thank you.